and welcome to the first video of a YouTube channel, which I'm hoping to call Non-Fic Lit, discussing the very best in nonfiction literature, where we discuss books from a variety of different disciplines, including economics, philosophy, sociology, psychology, politics, and just current events. This time we're reviewing a book that I think is very important in light of current events, and that is No Trade is Free by Robert Lighthizer. As everyone is probably aware by now, the second Trump administration has issued a sweeping amount of tariffs that have had significant impact on the stock market, caused heated economic discussion, and a wave of angry protests. For that reason, I thought it would be appropriate to read a book that directly dealt with issues of Trump's trade policy in his first administration, as well as providing some of the arguments that one would encounter in favor of tariffs. And who better to explain these than Robert Lighthizer, who was a former member of Trump's cabinet and the United States Trade Representative between the years of 2017 to 2021. He also has about 40 years of experience in international trade and goes back as far as the Reagan administration. Now, obviously, the book does not deal directly with the current set of tariffs, which have been implemented under Trump's second term, but it does give some insight into the rationale behind this more aggressive trade policy, and it talks about the mechanics of actually executing and negotiating these trade agreements. To provide some, before going forward, I did want to provide some general breakdown of the book, as the book itself is divided into several parts. In the beginning, it's a little bit light with some historical background on the evolution of the United States as an economic power and its relationship to trade. Some of the theoretical underpinnings that Robert Lighthizer relies on in his framework. And the largest portion is actually dedicated to specific trade deals and discussions of trade partners including China, Europe, the NAFTA agreements, that's Canada and Mexico, as well as Korea. Now, while I'm sure most people find this pretty interesting, for the vast majority, the main question when you pick up a book like No Trade is Free is simply the question of why? Why tariffs? And while I'm not going to go through all of the arguments that are present in the book, and while this book itself is actually not a detailed economic study of the costs and benefits of international trade or has significant quantitative depth around what a trade policy should look like, it does provide some details as to arguments for why tariffs could be effective and why Robert Lighthizer and the first Trump administration thought that they would be effective for the United States. Now, a small disclaimer before going forward. I do not necessarily share these views, but I do want to present them in the most accurate way that I can, and just in the way in which they're written. The first argument, which I think is probably the most interesting, is the simple fact that a current account deficit in and of itself is something that most economists, regardless of their stripe, whether or not that's Keynesian, monetarist, or classical, did not think that a country could run for a substantial period of time. Most economists did not think that a country could run a sustained and fairly significant current account deficit for infinitum. Yet the US has been able to sustain a current account deficit of, I think, between 3 and 4% for about 25 to 30 years. And the question is, why? And for Robert Lighthizer, the answer is pretty simple. The answer is because there's some sort of currency manipulation going on by other countries who participate in trade with us, who artificially inflate our currency and deflate their own, thereby creating the necessary consumption for their own economic output and maintaining their domestic industries. In this context, the entire notion of the tariff sort of changes focus. Rather than being some mechanism imposed on a free market, in this case, the tariff is actually a stabilizing mechanism which is meant to correct a market distortion which is willfully being put on the market. Now, obviously, there's ways to get around this, and this is a pretty involved field of discussion, but I did always think that this argument had a lot of depth to it and raises a lot of interesting discussions as to whether or not the U.S. can run a current account deficit, whether or not the perpetual export of financial products, obviously to be able to support this current account deficit, can be maintained, and the negative consequences of maintaining such a deficit for an extended period of time. The second argument is pretty simple, and this is the one that most of us are generally acquainted with, and this is simply the statement that there's nothing particularly unique about tariffs. Every country has tariffs, and every country has tariffs against virtually every other country. In some cases, those tariffs are incredibly high, such as in the case of India, which has tariffs up to 100% on certain agricultural products, and also 100% tariffs, I believe, in automobiles at one point. And the US average tariff rate is not particularly substantial. So in other words, tariffs are just a mechanism that are perpetually utilized in the global economy, and there's nothing particularly unique about them. However, I think one of the primary and one more interesting arguments that Robert Lighthizer brings up, and I did really appreciate this one, and that is simply that tariffs are not the end in and of themselves, but are a tool in the arsenal of actual negotiations. So in other words, the idea is not simply to put a tariff on another country, but to use that tariff to get some sort of change, either in policy, maybe reducing the tariffs that that country has on some of our products, maybe for geopolitical reasons, or, for example, as for example, in the case of Korea, to reclassify that country or to push that country to reclassify itself from developing to developed. So in other words, for a country to have a sovereign trade policy, it needs tariffs as a sort of stick or as a mechanism to be able to get essentially what it wants out of its economic partners. The alternative to this, and what the U.S. seemed to have relied on prior to the Trump's first administration, was something like the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. However, this is an unelected bureaucratic body, and as such it is highly inefficient, it's slow-moving, and it is also subject to the national interests of some of its key arbiters. So for Robert Lighthizer, this makes it a highly ineffective mechanism for actually achieving anything positive in trade. Now, whether or not that's true or not, he does go into great detail discussing why he believes that this is the case, but nonetheless, that is the argument as it stands for sort of bringing trade policy closer to home and using it from a state perspective instead of simply trying to mediate through a bureaucratic body which might have its own specific agendas and issues. And the final argument that I wanted to mention was more of a counter-argument, but it's a counter-argument to something that we hear very often and something that I don't really enjoy. It's an argument that I personally don't particularly like. It I think is oftentimes mentioned by people that should know better. And I'm sure we've encountered this before, and this is simply the statement that that to run a trade deficit is similar to on a personal level to you running a deficit with your grocery store, where you buy goods from them and they never buy anything from you. And yet you don't seem to object. And so similarly, running a current account deficit for the US as a country isn't really any more objectionable than that. And I think Robert Lighthizer does point out very accurately that this is not an apt analogy. This is not an apples-to-apples comparison. When you run a current account deficit, you are essentially exporting financial products, right? You are essentially still putting currency into circulation, which is oftentimes going to go back to the United States with, a purchase of government debt or other types of credit. So in a more apt analogy would probably be something like you go to buy groceries from a grocery store, don't have sufficient money, and borrow it from the grocer himself. And you just do this for about 20 to 30 years. And I think this is a far more accurate representation of our current trade position than the simple grocery store model. As you can tell, I do not like that argument, so I was I was eager to point out how, at least from a personal level, how ridiculous it sounds. But with those said, Robert Lighthizer has multiple other discussions about his own specific opinions and motivations for believing in the effectiveness of tariffs and bringing back industry into the United States, his own personal motivations for that. But I'll leave those for people who are actually interested in the book. Now I want to move on to the largest section of the book, which is his specific discussion on China. And China itself occupies about 100 pages of the book, almost about a third. And most of this develops Lighthizer's general thesis, which is that he believes that the United States and China are fundamentally incompatible in terms of their political and social systems. And with China's explicit ambitions, this makes any kind of economic union between ourselves precarious and at times almost suicidal. And by participating in this union, we're essentially financing our own destruction by providing our key economic rival, who he believes is probably our biggest economic rival that we've ever encountered, the financial tools to essentially undermine our position on the global stage. Now, whether or not you believe this or not, this is a fundamental influence in his type of thinking. And at times, this section I did think dragged a little bit. I think even the most ardent reader of the Epoch Times would find that, maybe this was spelled out in too much detail. But nonetheless, this was a fundamental influence for the kind of radical trade policy that was undertaken under the first Trump administration. And this is something that Robert Lighthizer carried forward with him when he was actually negotiating his deals with China, which he described in pretty dramatic detail. And when I mean dramatic, I do mean dramatic. There was a lot of conversations about, like last-minute changes to trade agreements, deals falling through, the use of reciprocal tariffs and trade wars, underhanded practices. There was even a very interesting story about manipulating the translation of specific words between the English and the Chinese version of the agreement to undermine some of the meaning. I thought this section was really interesting and just really quite fascinating to read. And reading the characters and the individuals involved was just quite fascinating to me. And I thought was one of the highlights of the book, to be honest. This section is followed closely by specific other discussions of his negotiations of NAFTA, which renamed the USMCA, along with Korea and Europe. And this one also had a lot of very interesting details. I specifically liked this conversation on NAFTA and how when the deal was originally signed, many of the products that were supposed to be utilized, specifically NAFTA was oftentimes associated with the building of automobiles. But to make sure that the automobile stayed largely in North America, there was restrictions on where the parts for the automobile themselves could be produced. Where I believe it was about 60% of the parts that went to the automobile had to be produced in North America. But to not be overly bureaucratic, new parts, with technological innovation that had to be incorporated in vehicles were automatically grandfathered in, even though they couldn't maybe be created outside of North America. And this was acceptable for the short term where, for not every single unique bolt had to be approved by some sort of bureaucratic body. But after about 20 years, for example, the vast majority of the products that were utilized in these vehicles were simply grandfathered in and were not being produced in North America at all. This was an interesting little tidbit, I thought, in the discussion of the NAFTA agreement, which I thought was particularly interesting, or at least really stood out to me. But there was many such stories, all of which were pretty interesting. Also, one thing that I really liked or appreciated was the respect with which Robert Lighthizer addressed both political parties in the U.S. Obviously, throughout the book, he spoke pretty highly of Trump and him allowing the negotiation team significant flexibility, but was also very stern and unflinching in his resolve to sort of improve U.S. trade relations. Not improve U.S. trade relations, but improve U.S. position in regard to trade. But in the NAFTA part, Robert Lighthizer also mentions Nancy Pelosi and his great respect for her and how she was able to facilitate some of the legal aspects of this deal and the care and the insight with which she was able to do that. And this is, a kind of bipartisan praise that, I think currently you can only hear in, hushed tones and dark corridors. But it was very positive to hear this was kind of a breath of fresh air, especially in today's political environment. And then finally, Robert Lighthizer ends the book with just things to be done. And the section was also pretty interesting. Dealt with a few specific issues, such as the interaction of VAT taxes with an independent trade policy. If you don't know, VAT taxes are essentially sales taxes, but executed at the federal level. And whether or not, for example, Europe, which funds itself largely through a small income tax, but a large VAT tax, has an advantage over the US, which funds itself largely through a very large income tax, but a very small VAT. We don't have a VAT, but we have sales taxes at the state level. So, for example, when a French company wants to export to the US, they would have to pay a lower income tax domestically and a lower sales tax in the US. But if a US company wanted to export to France, they would pay the higher tax in terms of the VAT in France and a higher income tax in the US, and the trade implications of such a mismatch in tax policy. But there's several other things that were discussed as well, specifically things like the utilization of of customs, for example, by places like Amazon to kind of cheat or get around some of the tariffs that could be put in place and give themselves an unfair advantage. But overall, the book itself is filled with very interesting tidbits like the one that I've described. And if any of them strike you as particularly interesting, I would very highly recommend the book. And with that, I want to actually get to my actual overall conclusion of the book. And to be honest, it is very positive. I absolutely adored this book. I thought it was written very clearly, very concisely. I thought it had appeal for everyone who would read it. There was, if you're just interested to understand why someone would consider tariffs an effective foreign policy decision, I think there's some very good details to describe that. And on the other hand, if you're familiar with trade policy and you might think that some of these arguments might not have the level of detail or depth that you're looking for, you'd be pleased with some of the individual discussions, describing some of the characters that were involved, how the negotiation process actually went through, and some of these more specific details. So overall, I thought the book had something for virtually everyone. I did not think that it was politically heavy-handed in any way. As I said, I thought he was actually fairly fair to both political parties. And overall, I thought that the book itself was a very interesting read for anyone who would want to understand it, to understand Trump's trade policy, at least in his first term. I would also like to say that one of the motivations for this book was when the tariffs first came out, there was obviously a lot of questions, a lot of people were very confused, and listening to some of the people talk about this, I remember hearing a podcast by, honestly, once again, people that you probably know better. These were analysts, I believe, at Moody's, who were certainly more experienced than I was. And one of the first things that this host said was, I do this for a living and I don't understand this. So I can't imagine how the ordinary person feels on the street trying to understand this tariff position of the current administration. And hearing that, I just kind of almost rolled my eyes when I could say, well, you could understand it for the measly price of about $20. Now, maybe you're not going to understand it fully, but at the very least, this will provide you a really good background to be able to have an intelligent conversation on trade. And I think that, especially now with as much panic and as much heated discussion that's going on, I think that this context is very invaluable. And I would recommend anyone with an interest in trade policy or in international relations in general to pick up this book. So I would say that even if you're not into economics or don't understand economics, this book is very applicable, very easy to pick up, fairly short read, and I would recommend it 100%. And I hope that this small video was able to convince you to pick up No Trade is Free by Robert Lighthizer.